friends, good evening and welcome to this, the third of our Lent series courses. It's a great pleasure this evening to welcome as our speaker Guy Treweek, who is modestly described as Assistant Curate of St. Peter's, Hammersmith. He probably deserves a badge of honour being Assistant Curate of St. Peter's, Hammersmith. But in fact, he's beginning an ecclesiastical career after a distinguished career in finance. It says here, prior to ordination, he worked in the financial markets, initially for one of the largest hedge funds, D.E. Shaw & Co., and latterly as Director of Capital Markets for a niche investment bank, KBC Financial Products. That follows having studied economics in the LSE and Keio in Tokyo and theology in Cambridge and Yale. That's quite a CV to be working with, isn't it? So we're jolly lucky to have him this evening to talk about the tricky subject in this series on ethics, this tricky subject, ethics and the capital markets. And as usual, I'm going to begin by reciting the prayer for Advent Sunday, and then it will be a great pleasure to hand over to Guy. Almighty God, give us grace to cast away the works of darkness, and to put on the armour of light, now in the time of this mortal life, in which your Son, Jesus Christ, came to us in great humility, so that on the last day, when he shall come again in his glorious majesty, to judge the living and the dead, we may rise to the life immortal, through him who is alive and reigns with you and the Holy Spirit, one God, now and forever.
Amen.
Housekeeping points. I'll aim to speak probably for about 40 minutes or so and then have some Q&A at the end. So please, if I can ask you to save up questions until then. Although if I use a slide that you, if I use a topic or a phrase that you're unfamiliar with, then please don't hesitate to stop me. I'll try not to use jargon, but I'm afraid it may creep in, and please don't let it go unchallenged if I do. Now let's start off. As you can see, I think already advertised, my topic is going to be ethics and the capital markets. So starting off, who am I and what do I know about the subject? Nick has already given me a very kind introduction. But I just want to say I'm not an academic, far from it. I'm an assistant curate at St. Peter's, Black Lion Lane, and previously I had worked in the capital markets, as Nick said. In 1992, I started working part-time at BZW in Tokyo, where I was a graduate student, and just as a matter of coincidence, it turned out that my supervisor there, a few months after I arrived, became economic advisor to the incoming Prime Minister at the time, Kiichi Miyazawa, which actually opened quite a considerable number of doors for me. When I returned to England, I joined one of the biggest and most respected US hedge funds, D.E. Shaw & Co. And latterly, when my team was sold to a European bank assurance group, KBC, I was director on the capital markets desk, where I reported to the global head of new issues. I don't particularly like the term capitalist. I think it fails to do justice to the breadth of all that the market contains. But I suppose my day job, as it did revolve around capital and providing of it, I suppose I do have to say, if anyone was a capitalist, it was me. I was part of that, raising money for large and mid-cap companies. So, some opening remarks. The title of the talk is Ethics of the Capital Markets, and so I want to start off with the question, what is the ethic market participants hold to or should hold to? Now, some of these are issued on arrival. When you start working in the market, you have to take your professional exam and such, and so some of these are just givens. First one will be, do not lie and do not misrepresent. Do not offer someone stock in Shell, for example, and then give them ESSO. Do not say you're going to sell someone 2% bonds and then give them 5% ones. So, don't lie. Second thing is, my word is my bond. This is the motto, some of you may have heard, it was the motto of the old London Stock Exchange, meum dictum pactum, my word is my bond. If I say a trade is done, it is done. It is not subject to renegotiation later on. The third one, and this was perhaps something that holds more true to the part of the market that I was in, which I think truly is capital markets, is that one only transacted with professionals, those who understood the products that one was dealing with. I had no retail customers, no individuals in that way. So our guiding principles sort of came effectively with the job on arrival too, but these weren't directly written down, they weren't regulations, they were implied or commercially derived. One of these might be to give the customer what he or she wants, be that a structure, be it a price, be it a size, be it an idea that will help them make their objective happen. Another one would be, do not waste time. Time is the most precious commodity we have. We don't know how much of it we've got, and we can't get any more of it, so don't waste it. And the last one is add value. And this is something that the fathers themselves were particularly concerned with. The church has actually had real interest in this subject of adding value throughout. I don't know if any of you have ever read any William of Ockham. You might have heard the phrase Occam's razor. He's the guy who coined that understanding. But he talks a lot about this point, how things become our property because humans actually add value to them. You know, we pluck an apple from the tree, God's creation, but in the plucking, in the preparing of it, it becomes our property. We have added something to it, added value. So, my objective tonight is to move beyond these rather dry principles to show you how in the marketplace in general, and in the capital markets in particular, I believe a forum exists for God's saving work to unfold. And I hope I can get you to share my excitement and my hope. Now, this forum exists not by some diktat of planning, but by nature, the divine economy, the household of God. So I want us to touch on three things that relate to and interpenetrate with the market. Firstly, I want to talk to you about the Great Commandment. Someone tell me what the Great Commandment is.
Love your God with all your heart, mind and soul, and love your neighbour as yourself.
Love your neighbour as yourself. The first commandment, love of neighbour and of self. Thank you very much. To help our counterparties, to give them what they want, to help them achieve their objectives, and in doing so, the same for ourselves. Secondly, to see the situation of all people, especially the poorest, advanced. And thirdly, to see patterns of good behaviour, patterns that are socially beneficial, ethical patterns at the heart of things. Two-way, contributing to and being encouraged by market action. And so, there are four conclusions, four theses, to use an academic word I might say. That first is that recent events in the capital markets are no different from any other form of social interaction. They're mixtures of predominantly good, but with the bad too. That they spring from our anthropology, from what it is to be human, and also they come from the aspects of what it is to live in a fallen world. That they have within them reflections of the image and nature of God. Sorry, excuse me. Always the way the modern world, eh? Thank you very much. Yeah, that's all right. Hoist on my own petard there. There we are. So this is what happens when you work in the marketing. You always want to be contactable. So where was I? That they have within them reflections of the image and nature of God. That the sin that is within them is often that of excess, coming from something that is good and God-given, procreation, a God-given good, a drive within us, in excess, is lust. That of rest, we think of the seventh day, the Sabbath, that turns to sloth in excess. That of productivity, of work, we see the image of God, the divine worker, at the beginning of Genesis. We think of Joseph as being effectively Jesus' sort of apprentice master as such. That productivity, that thing that is within us, can turn to greed and selfishness when it is in excess. The next one. That demonisation of the other, is sinful in the marketplace, no less than in any other. Perhaps you may have already seen some of these unpleasant cartoons of fat cat Jewish bankers from the 1930s press. Very little has changed. Easy targets, unloved. And part of our human condition so much is that we need to blame. We always need to blame. And we need someone to push out, someone to crucify. Need longer arms. So back to our list. Thirdly, that general truths can be discerned from particularities of what we encounter, from our experience. We can discern such things of general truth from real world examples that we can see amongst other places in the marketplace. And lastly, that the perfection and redemption of the market, as in all things, comes from Jesus Christ. That followers of Jesus, keeping his example of generosity, openness of communication, and of consideration for others, can act as a catalyst that transforms the whole, like the parable of the leaven. This is what Christians are called to be and to do, to add their Christian ethic to all their human action, including the economic. Now from here, I'd like to go on to talk about some examples to try and illustrate those particularities that I've talked about. Jürgen Moltmann, who is a fairly famous modern theologian, said, "We must discover the universal in the concrete." We must discover the universal in the concrete. I agree with him. We can discern things of general truth from the individual particularities of our own experience. And the particular here, the concrete examples of my experience that I want to delve into this evening will be capital market ones. And in particular, I am going to pick some pilloried ones, scourged things, mocked in the media. Just the sort of place Christians look for truth. So I want to talk to you about derivatives. CDOs, is that a phrase that people are familiar with, CDO? CDO stands for a collateralised debt obligation. They have actually been charged as being one of the things that brought about the credit crunch. They put huge pressure on some major banks' balance sheets, some major investors' balance sheets. So CDOs, collateralised debt obligations, CLOs, very, very similar indeed, only the L instead of the D stands for loans, collateralised loan obligations. And the last, hedge funds. So we'll go on to the first one. I tried to find a nice complicated machine. I was looking for a sort of Heath Robinson thing, but this was the closest I could get. We tend to think of derivatives as being extremely complicated instruments. So what is a financial derivative? It's an unpopular product now, so what are they? Don't they just destroy wealth? Are they weapons of mass wealth destruction? Well, no, they aren't actually. Used properly, quite the contrary. Here's a fairly technical description from Barron's, one of the major financial dictionaries. Describes a derivative as a transaction or contract whose value depends on, or as the name implies, derives from, the value of underlying assets such as stocks, bonds, mortgages, market indices, or foreign currencies. One party with exposure to an unwanted risk can pass some or all of that risk to a second party. Basically, derivatives are linked by value to another asset, and they can be used to pass on some of the benefit and risk that is acquired with ownership, whilst retaining other parts. The market excels at distributing things. That is what the market is very, very good at repackaging things to meet the specific need of others. We don't all grow our own vegetables, do we? We don't even buy it at greengrocers anymore. We go to supermarkets. Why? Because it's convenient. Just like we have cars, we have PCs, we have iPhones. We like things that add value to what we want, how we want, and increasingly when we want them, which is always now. So, topped and tailed mange tout from Kenya. It might be more convenient for someone to spend an extra 5 minutes at work to pay that premium. Better for them, and better for a worker in Kenya. Derivatives help us slice and dice financial products to maximise their value, and to give the constituent parts to those who value them the most. This is creativity at work. If not from nothing, then from financial clay and dust, responding to a need, which the market calls demand, seeing potential, moulding, refashioning, cutting, severing, transplanting, combining, and in the end, more value is created. Surely this is no surprise. Human beings are beings of relationship. What is God in Trinity, if not relationship personified? When we act as creatures made in the image of God, then creation occurs. New creation occurs. As does hope. And dare we say it, so does love come into existence. Charity, to use the old word. Aren't we made to respond to generosity with generosity? Isn't this the story that the Gospels reveal to us? Now, an example. This is an example of how derivatives slice and dice products to maximise values, the way that I actually have just said so. Now, shall I explain what a convertible bond? Is that a term that perhaps, let me explain that. A convertible bond is something that looks like debt, looks like a bond, but in it has an embedded equity option, and frequently a currency option too, when the underlying stock that the bond can be exchanged for is in a different currency to the bond. Say, for example, it might be issued by an American company but denominated in euros, whereas the underlying stock of that company, which it converts into, is actually a dollar-denominated stock. So there's an embedded, so the price of the equivalent stock value behind the bond will be moving around both with the stock price, but also with the exchange rate. So we have three different components: equity, foreign exchange, and debt. Now, we can split these. We can sell the debt to a debt investor, the equity to an equity investor, and the FX, if there is any, to a foreign currency investor. Who benefits? All of them. The purchasers with something not otherwise available, so there is new supply, additional supply, which means the price at which they can buy it is lower, and the borrower, or in this case the issuer, is able to tap a much larger potential customer base because he's not just only able to sell it to convertible bond investors, is selling it to an even bigger marketplace of debt, equity and FX investors too. So because he's got a much bigger potential demand base, then he can raise more funds, greater capacity, and at a lower cost of funding. He doesn't have to pay as much interest. Everyone in the transaction there, buyer and seller, both sides, benefits. Another example. Think of energy futures. If I'm a big power company and I can buy futures or options to smooth my energy supplies going forward, then I need to build less power stations than would otherwise be the case. All the market participants can share their excess capacity. And the more active the trading is for such products in the so-called secondary market, after the instruments have been issued the first time, the secondary trading market, the more active that is, the more likely it is that participants will be willing to rely upon it. They know they can always go out and buy more supply if necessary. It comes at a price, yes, but in the long term, at less cost than if they build the extra power station and have it sit idle for much of the year. Think about the environmental effects. What are the ethics there? Having unnecessary pollution and greater exposure to catastrophic risk because we reject market trading of such derivatives. Bit tough to understand, so let's ban it. Think of the BP catastrophe in the Gulf of Mexico last year, and think of the current nuclear nightmare that we have in Fukushima. Do we really want more oil wells, more nuclear power stations than we absolutely need? The conclusion I draw is that rather than see derivatives as a tool by which risk is increased exponentially, as I seem to read in a number of newspapers, we might more accurately, or at the very least as a minimum, see them as a means of lowering risk, of sharing or transferring risk to those with the most appetite for them, and perhaps with the best understanding of those risks too. For derivatives facilitate specialisation. Specialisation, the key building block for wealth creation. If you've heard the agrarian village example, sometimes in the contemporary world we act as if economic wealth is a zero-sum game. That if we have one additional hamburger here in London, that someone somewhere else in the world will have the equivalent of one hamburger less to go round. That there is a finite amount to be split. This is simply not true to our understanding. Think of, we go back in time, some period of time, to the point when transport was nothing like what it is at the moment. Let's just say we have our one village. Look at myself, for example. I'm pretty incompetent as far as sort of making things is concerned with my hands. If I were responsible for feeding myself, for growing my own crops to eat, to make my own clothes, to make the shoes that I wear, to look after, if my wife was going to have a medical problem, to look after her, those are things that barely would I be able to stay alive, barely function. But when we specialise, when we're able to use the gifts that God has given us, the skills in a particular area, then all sorts of things can happen. Someone can grow the food, someone can make the shoes, someone can make the clothes. That greater wealth is created. Specialisation. So I'm just my place. I'm going to go back to it. Here we are. So surely this fits with the Christian understanding of human nature I mentioned earlier. We are made to be in relationship, more creative, more productive. And when we are more used to our fellow beings in very practical terms, as well as the empathetic ones, it's not just able to comfort someone, but to be very practical in our help. Servants, attentive to the needs of others. not just to the most wealthy. Look at Tesco, look at Aldi, look at Walmart. Where can poor people get good quality products at cheap prices? As Archbishop Rowan has put it, is being really human, being free from the needs of others? Of course it is not. And in the marketplace, this can be especially true, for when undistorted, it is driven, it exists to meet the needs of others as best its constituent participants can. Now, moving on. CDOs and CLOs, collateralised debt obligations, collateralised loan obligations. Now, this is another type of repackaged financial product, the class that has been seen to be central to the credit crunch. So what are they? So collateralised debt obligations are diversified, multi-class securities backed by pools of bonds, bank loans or other assets. These securities are typically divided into several tranches that have differing levels of credit tolerance and typically contain at least one class of investment-grade bonds. So that's the very highest quality. Basically, they're a pool of different kinds of debt. It's a pool of debt which has been split and sliced. So debt derivatives, if you will. And they behave in the way that I've just talked about. CDOs repacked debt in such a way that they attracted more buyers, more investors than had previously been possible. Barriers of entry were lowered. For example, a European bank didn't need an expensive US branch network in order to get exposure to US mortgages. So they enabled banks to lend more by selling down their existing exposure, making room for new. Why would they do this? Because they wanted to meet the needs of their customers who were looking to borrow more and their books were full. Furthermore, products like these enabled debt investors to access part of the market otherwise unavailable to them. For example, small European banks accessing US borrowers. This could have been good, more diversified portfolios, lower overall risk, loan risk spread across a much wider investor base than previously, which should have led to a more stable market. But that wasn't how things turned out. Clearly, big mistakes were made. Credit rating agencies assessed the quality of these instruments far too favourably, leading to them being mispriced and inadequate capital being allocated to them at every level. It was sloppy work, which led to cross-contamination with terrible damage done as a result. That money was lent too cheaply. But who was hurt? And who benefited? Well, certainly bankers did with their bonuses. Consumer borrowers did too. They got that money cheap. Think of all those 0% introductory offers we saw for credit cards, new cars, fancy holidays, and the even fancier handbags. And who shouted foul? Not the regulators, not the politicians, not until it was far too late. The fundamental issue here was too much money looking for investment opportunities. We'd gone through a period of time where a lot of profit had been made, and people were looking to put it into the market to invest in. And too much of that went into too risky areas. This was a professional error, and where it took place as a result of greed or arrogance, it was sinful too. Sinful not just because of what it did get spent on, but what it didn't. Emerging market products were much harder to place. I know this, I can remember trying to place an African bond issue and finding bordering on, I wouldn't say the impossible, we did get it placed, but it was very, very hard work relative to something somewhere else in the world. Emerging market products were much harder to place, especially when they came from the poorest and most backward places. The question I am left with is what returns would have been generated if we'd put that excess money, into Africa instead, to Africa, to the emerging world, instead of into European consumer lending. We do not know the answer to that question because it didn't happen. So, one question that is frequently put forward is, why didn't the bankers just say no? Why not just no? Well, part of the question is, at what point should a lender say no to a borrower? It's quite clear cut if it's to do with a particular project, finance a particular asset. Look at the transaction, see if it makes sense, yes, no. But what if the use is unspecified? Should the banker demand that information? Make the loan conditional? Say no if he doesn't like the use? This takes us into very judgmental territory, paternalistic, many would say outrageous. You, no fancy handbag for you. You, no holiday this year in Barbados, Bognor instead. Very, very judgmental. Very judgmental. Yet this is a kind of thinking that seems to lie behind some of the public debate. And the question I think that we need to ask is, isn't this at odds with the Christian understanding of being human? We have responsibility for our own actions, and actions have consequences. Indeed, in nature, bad decisions have devastating consequences. So, why should our markets be any different from nature? Should they be unnatural? Should Lehman's have been bailed out? Or Fannie Mae? Or Northern Rock? What were the alternatives? I'd like to share an example. This example comes from the year 1772. Note that date, 1772. In that year, 22 significant Scottish banks fell in 12 days. Now, this was the period and place of the Enlightenment's high watermark. Adam Smith and David Hume were there. Now, those defaults had knock-on impact in Amsterdam as well. But the situation was resolved in both Holland and Scotland by cooperative efforts between the bankers. The weakest went to the wall. The sound were supported by their peers. Previous quality of action had consequences. And it is more than interesting, I think, to note that the English government's attempts to lend support in this crisis were directed towards another company deemed too big to fail. That company was the East India Company, which was already in some considerable financial difficulty, which was made yet worse by this Scottish credit crunch. The result of that, the English government's action, was the Tea Act of 1773, which you may remember was the catalyst for the Boston Tea Party and England's loss of the North American colonies. Yet another example of short-term political considerations having unintended consequences. Go on to the third product. Hedge fund. Oops, that's my heart there. Here's how Okay, so just say no legal or regulatory definition of a hedge fund. No formal one, as there are for many other asset classes. There's more by praxis. It's hard to pin down. Is a hedge fund a type of investor? Is it an asset class? Or is it a strategic mindset, or merely a way of charging fees? Hedge funds typically charge higher fees than traditional investment products. And so the cynical amongst you might say that some hedge funds aren't really hedge funds at all, but just are ordinary investments with higher fee structures. And if you were to think that, I might have quite a lot of sympathy with that view. Now, this is a fast developing business, but one of the industry associations has put in a good definition of what it is here, I think. A hedge fund constitutes an investment program whereby the managers or partners seek absolute returns by exploiting investment opportunities while protecting principal from potential financial loss. What this means is that they are searching for absolute returns, which is to say they're not trying to track an index or another investment company. They're not trying to outperform. What they're trying to do is absolute return. And they're looking to protect the portfolio against negative movements in the wider market, which all sounds good. So why do they have the wood taken to them so often? Well, the charge is that hedge funds increase systemic risk. They increase systemic risk, the argument goes, because they are excessively geared, which can force death spiral selling when capital assets come under price pressure. Too many hedge funds have the same strategies and investments. This can lead to a market-wide cascade of selling. Furthermore, selling pressure on illiquid assets can be exacerbated if too much capital is tied up in illiquid investments, and which therefore cannot be sold at short notice. There is truth in this. Can anyone name a hedge fund for me? Big hedge fund?
Horseman Global.
Say again?
Horseman Global.
Horseman Global, don't know that one.
Man.
Say again, Man's a good, yeah, Man's a big one there. I'm thinking one that quite often is pulled out to me at this point is LTCM, which was one of the really big ones that actually blew up back in the late 90s. Okay. LTCM. It's the example that I've got here, I'll throw it in. That particular fund had some of the brightest academics in finance as its founding as partners. They actually had 2 Nobel laureates on the staff, together with some of the most trading savvy investment professionals on Wall Street, and they were not able to avert one of the largest disasters in financial history. In fact, they may have exacerbated it. And I think the point to take from this, or at least that I take from this, is that if those guys could get it wrong, then governments or anyone else has actually got very little chance of doing so. One of the interesting things, I think, though, is that when LTCM failed, no small investors got hurt, unlike Enron, which was in a very highly regulated sector. From start to close, LTCM, despite that disaster, compounded for most investors their capital at 18% per annum. And I believe that it is shameful that small investors are prevented from investing in hedge funds, that instead they are made largely the preserve of the super rich, and instead small investors are tacitly encouraged to invest in things like ISAs, SIPs, PEPs, unit trusts, which are in blue chip equity markets where some of the biggest catastrophes lurk. Enron lost $66 billion. LTCM lost less than 5. Okay. Another charge that's levelled against hedge funds is that they are big short sellers. And short selling is regarded as something which is toxic to the marketplace. They are indeed big short sellers, but I don't believe short selling to be toxic. Quite the contrary when used in the disciplined way that many hedge funds do. For I think it's worth keeping in mind that the vast majority of short positions held by hedge funds, so a short position is that, I realise I use a term there that might not be familiar to some. is that so a short position is rather like a negative position. You might, so if you have your unit trust, you say, okay, I've got 1,000 shares of so-and-so, which you actually have. A short selling is effectively you have a negative position. You have to borrow the stock in order to sell it short. So hedge funds have the vast majority of their short positions are not so-called naked positions, but are set up as a hedge. For example, they're long an option, short the underlying stock, or they're long a basket of stocks and short index futures. So there is no act of speculation, it is insurance. They're protecting their investors against market declines using highly complicated trading models, so-called black box models, that quantify the relative movements of different securities. If anyone's more interested in that, then please we can talk about that at the Q&A. It's not a case of smashing stocks to pieces just like financial balance. So hedge funds, as Paul might say, are not, by no means, the one-stop villains of the piece. Although clearly, this is a community like many others, where crooks and charlatans hid themselves. I think people like Bernie Madoff. That said, is this any different from the vigilance we need to keep on those coming into our own woods, social, charitable or parish? We are commanded to beware wolves in sheep's clothing, and to be as shrewd as serpents, whilst remaining as innocent as doves. A very high call. And the hedge community, like so many others, church included, gets it wrong. And sometimes getting it wrong has devastating consequences. But fortunately for all of us, most people see that it's not the whole community that's tainted, but a few bad apples. But they do expect that they be cut out. I see a mirroring here of the church's failures to protect children adequately, especially in Ireland, where to wear a clerical collar invites public pillory. A whole tranche of society should not be tarred because of the actions, terrible though they be, of a small minority. And I go back to remembering that cartoon that we had of earlier. And that is why, despite the bad hype, investors are lining up to get involved in hedge funds. Trust has not broken down, hope abounds. Investors are lining up because of inspected returns, not just of a short-term bounce, but long-term. They have low standard deviations of return, which means a consistent level of absolute return, and not market directional plays alone, which is especially attractive if you think the market might fall further. And that is why smart investors are entrusting their capital to smart managers. And investors who fund hedge funds are smart, and they are well informed, and they are experienced. Cambridge, Harvard, Yale, Princeton. And they're not afraid to pull their money out and then put it back in. The latest estimates I've seen this month from Deutsche Bank have record inflows to hedge funds in 2011 of more than $200 billion, which is a fourfold increase on last year. Clearly investors have not lost an appetite for risk. Which takes us back to the fact that hedge funds help stabilise the market, putting money in when others won't. In actual fact, when others are trying to get out, so they hold prices up and support. They're smart and they're disciplined and they bounce back fast, which brings great opportunity. Majority of big, well-respected investment institutions can't get involved in projects which are too risky. Their trustees, offering documents and all sorts of limitations upon them prevent them from doing so. Hedge funds are much less likely to be as constrained as traditional institutional investors. Now clearly some of them are specially designated for certain strategies or regions, but many are not. They can invest in things other funds might be unable to, even if the fund managers personally wanted to do so. Africa, for example. Look at the relative debt slide here. Look at aid budgets relative to capital markets. Major Western aid budgets are peanuts relative to private capital. Hedge fund assets alone, just hedge funds, are 15 times OECD aid. Global equity markets are more than 380 times the entire of the OECD's aid. That is 123 billion versus $47 trillion. Why pillory a community that is most able and best equipped to pour huge volumes of capital into the poorest parts of the world? India and China have been big cases in point, have received huge investment. It is shameful that Africa has missed out. Why are we not working with hedge funds instead? And if we'd done so a decade earlier, what might the effect have been on the economic situation we experience? I asked this question earlier. If that money had gone to higher yielding capital projects in Africa rather than low yielding property and consumer lending in the US and Europe, what might have happened? Who knows? But I suspect both hemispheres would have benefited, and I pray the time will be right in the decade to come. Now, some final thoughts. They'll be relieved today. I started with a quote: we must discover the universal in the concrete, and I believe we can. The examples of market action which we've looked at offer us insights into true human nature. As creatures made in the image of God, as Genesis 1 tells us, to use the Greek words which uses image as icon, an icon, our actions can be a window through which we can discern more of God and of how we are intended to be and not to be. Creators, neighbours, mutual servants. But we cannot also fail to discern the fool, our brokenness and our need for perpetual reorientation on the healing and perfecting that only relationship with Jesus Christ can bring. In this sorry saga of recent years, there are many parallels we can make with the account of the fool that Genesis rehearses for us. But 4 seem to me to be especially relevant and worth pondering on. The first is our succumbing to temptation, the offer of the fruit, of knowledge, of power, of a longing to be more like those we look up to, more like those we revere. Second, our hubris, our arrogance. Remember the Tower of Babel. To be so caught up in our own arrogance that we lose sight of how much we need God and how, on our own, all that we do can turn to dust. A particularly Lenten reminder. Remember, O man, that thou art dust, and to dust thou shalt return. Thirdly, jealousy. Cain and Abel. Our resentment at the undeserved success of another can drive a wedge between us that fractures whole communities and drains potential from all of us. And fourthly and lastly, by our knee-jerk response of blaming someone else. Knee-jerk. Adam blamed Eve. Eve blamed the serpent. It was the woman you put here, the man said. She gave me the fruit, and I ate it. You did it. You did it. Remember the cartoon. It is in recognising such failures in ourselves that we can begin to reorient ourselves to the direction that leads to life, to turn away from fallen values towards kingdom ones, to turn to Christ. As that masterpiece of Anglican liturgy, the General Thanksgiving, puts it for us, as it directs our thoughts and prayers, that we show forth thy praise not only with our lips but in our lives, by giving up ourselves to thy service and by walking before thee in holiness and righteousness all our days. This talk is entitled Ethics in the Capital Markets. I suspect some of you may think you've heard the self-justification of an investment banker. If so, this was the opposite of my purpose, and I would seek to disabuse you of it. Many others have criticised, and criticism is indeed due, but not with bankers alone. The market is a hugely widespread, interconnecting thing. It's alive, changing, adapting, evolving. Why? Why is it so? Because it is us. It is you and I. And that is how we are. Each of us is part of it. Those of us with pensions, mortgages, bank accounts, credit cards, leased cars, ISAs, we are part of the capital markets. And our greed and our inflexibility, our unwillingness to get personally involved contributed to the mess that unfolded. As Samuel warned the people of Israel in 1 Samuel 8, abdication of responsibility has painfully costly consequences. But the Spirit blows where it will, and the market is no exception. So despite the failures, amazing things happen, redemptive things. And the potential for even more to take place is accelerating. Why? Because of our creativity. New products, solving old problems and logjams, structured products, derivatives, risk hedging strategies, new pools of assets less constrained by business in the same old ways. And the end result of all this can be to the benefit of all, to our neighbours and of ourselves, just as we command. Not as gift, not as donor to supplicant, but as equal counterparts, both choosing to enter into common relationship of individual free will, and both bringing something of value. One brings capital, the other something else, labour and opportunity perhaps. Both benefit with even more than they bring. Creation from nothing. From nothing but the ever-active, dynamic generosity of God, into which we add our own efforts, our own gifts, our own talents. These are the things we, the market, need to rediscover and hold fast to. This is our responsibility to our neighbour, to use the most powerful tool at our disposal in helping the least of these. This, I believe, is the true ethic that needs to drive the capital markets and all others. Sadly, the recent past has fallen far short of this, as have all of us. But I live in hope. Amen. Now, we have quite a lot to digest, but if you have any questions arising from that or any other topics, then I would be happy to do my best in answering them.
Thank you very much, Guy, for a very thorough investigation into the world of financial ethics and a reminder of our own persistence in the process. Lisa.
I wanted to follow up on your comment about the lack of private sector investment in Africa.
Please.
Surely, if you talk about hedge funds as being short-term,
Sorry,
the actions, this is the way I heard it, that they work on a relatively short-term basis.
Understood. In which case, I should just correct you. Sorry, that isn't what I intended to say. I think I may have said short selling, but not short term.
They don't work over the 30 to 40 to 50-year investment cycle, which is what official aid firms do work on. And part of the problem, sorry, I should declare interest. I worked on official aid programs for all my working life. And part of the problems, one of the problems that we encountered was the lack of willingness of the private sector to take a punt on getting that return after that kind of length of time. How, if you're talking about return on investment, can you get that kind of mindset into private sector investment?
I think, firstly, there are all sorts of different levels there. It's quite a technical question. I think that when you're talking about something like 50-year funding as such, then in actual fact, I think we've got to compare apples with apples, and it would be very difficult to get funding for that level actually here in Europe for a company for that. unless we're talking about something that is absolutely massive, like a sort of in the US market, for example, Ford or GM might have been able to issue really long-term paper like that. Otherwise, it's just not going to happen. Okay. I think that.
Big engineering projects.
Say again.
Big engineering projects. The funding is required
For projects, yeah.
The payback is much longer.
I mean, I think your point is well made. Is that in all of these cases, it is harder to get people interested in African projects, in emerging world projects, compared to European ones. The point that I was making was that if anyone is able to be willing to actually invest in those, it is the hedge community. That they are the ones who can do so. That is where the greatest potential is. Clearly, we're looking at relative. Here's aid, insufficient. Potentially, you can clap, you can get into this much. Of course, ideally, it'd be great if you could get into here. That ain't happening. I said, not happening at the moment. Too much of the investors who are in this part of the market are too constrained. They wouldn't be able to. Here, we have a potential. Even if you can only tap a couple of percent of that, a couple of percent, we'll be doubling this. How can we not be trying to do that? And there are interesting projects. Maybe 50-year ones, I agree, is a bridge too far to start off with. Maybe you need to find something that's a 3-year project, even a 12-month project potentially. Get people to see that they can actually make money, not lose it, be confident, and then they start getting more interested in longer-term stuff. And in terms of illiquid projects, which is the sort of thing which I think we're talking about, where we're talking about not getting your capital back for an extended period of time, potentially not even getting revenue back, then of course that is it's hard.
Kind of investment.
But you need to start off small, I think, and we aren't even there. So we need to actually start creating some momentum. You can't suddenly jump to doing your PhD. You've got to do your A-levels first, sort of thing. So please.
I find your case beguiling, but I'm afraid I'm utterly unconvinced. I think the danger is this, that what you seem to be arguing is that in an age of ever-increasing inequality, in fact, we in the United States and various other societies are now more unequal than they have been since the beginning of the last century almost, that there is an equality of blame for what's happened, and indeed an equality of greed. Now, I know we're all fallen, but I think there may be gradations of falling.
The blame, yeah, the blame.
And I think that's actually where, and sometimes the more one hears about some of these bankers, including most, in fact one of them we can't even call the banker, the guy you showed.
Fred Goodwin,
I
would name him, can't we?
I thought that was a slightly unfair juxtaposition actually, because the 1930s cartoon was a racist cartoon. Unless you think any Scotsman who's vilified, any cartoon vilifying Scotsman is racist.
I think
that was a personal ad hominem thing. But all I can say on that is that there are people in the world of finance who seem to operate on a completely different level of greed from normal fallen humanity. I exclude myself from this, but I would be very surprised if most people had that interest in acquiring the huge amount of resources that bankers do. Just today we heard about the chief executive, the new chief executive of Lloyds, on top of his squillions of pounds worth of salary, is being given the 4.1 million that he lost as a result of leaving Santander early. It was a retention bonus. He's now being given that by Lloyds, initially by the taxpayer. These are levels of desire for material acquisition that I think most of us find almost incomprehensible. What do you do with 10, 12 million pounds a year? And I think to sort of say that we're all equally to blame is avoiding the moral issue, so that Western societies should be doing more to tackle the huge inequalities that are occurring in our society. I mean the other people I would blame actually are the politicians. I think it's no accident that we had two vaguely left-of-centre governments in the United States and the UK in the 1990s who had to abandon tax and spend because it was so unpopular with the electorate, and were using the monetary credit system to achieve what couldn't be achieved through fiscal redistribution. So, for example, in the United States, by congressional act, banks could no longer deny credit to people simply because they were straight out of jail or, you know, have low incomes or whatever. And similarly in this country, the government, you know, was quite happy to see credit explode because it, you know, because in the short run it had the effect of increasing standard of living. But you know, again, you were saying that, well, why denying people handbags, denying people this, denying people that? The people who now have found their mortgages foreclosed are in a desperate situation. Yes, they had it easy for, you know, easier than they would have done for 5 or 10 years. The people who borrowed to get their handbags out, they're now having to sort of step down their consumption to pay off these awful debts that they're now faced with. I think that to see all this as the working, you know, as a sort of working out of Christian social interaction seems to me to be very far wide of the mark. I'm sorry, but I find it totally unconvincing.
So, was there a question? Sorry.
Well, I suppose I suppose the question at the end of all this is: do you really think that there aren't some people within the financial world whose greed led them to undertake activities which have been to the long-term detriment of the vast majority of their fellow citizens? And should be condemned as such.
I think it's hard to say for the vast majority of, but certainly do I think people entered into decisions out of personal greed that have had consequences on many, many other people? Yes, I do. And of course it's something
and that is immoral and is a level of immorality beyond the level of immorality that...
The point I think your point is well made, sir, and I do take that in that I think that there are some people who are clearly more involved than others. And there are different levels of involvement. Some of them sins of commission, others sins of omission, because we simply abdicate responsibility.
And I suppose the other question...
can we let someone else?
If I might, you know, because it does arise from the same thing. The huge inequality that's been, the huge increase in inequality that's been associated with these developments, to me, seems fundamentally un-Christian. Would your view be that this is just a price worth paying for the other benefits that this system brings us?
I think that what I try to touch on is that of generosity. I think that when wealth is created, indeed wealth, the starting point of it is asymmetric. And I think that those who do have received anything with generosity, then there is an absolute responsibility that comes through that is actually passed on to others to the benefit of all. And that is where I think we are, no matter what our starting point is and what our end point is. Next question.
Thank you. Yes, in a sense, I'm following some things which have already been raised. And in relation to the lady's question, for example, I think there are big issues to do with research and all that kind of thing, which short-term approaches by big companies often denies and does damage this country considerably. But the point I was wanting to get onto was the issue of corruption of elites. I mean, we've heard about your CV and the brilliant people who work in banking and so on. And yes, you made an analogy with the priesthood, and I do take the points that we've made here. But it does seem as if elites like this can get so corrupted. I mean, you haven't referred to, for example, this film, The Inside Job, which some of us have seen, which describes the rottenness of the whole thing in terms of personal conduct and so on and so forth, and how the same people have succeeded in climbing back into situations when many of us, I think, here would think that we should be sacked. And okay, Fred Goodwin, an example perhaps. And I was just wondering, you know, whether in relation to all this, one has to look at economics through a different perspective to Adam Smith. I mean, you know, one might be interested in seeing, however devised through a better democratic system than communism, that the people of a country and indeed of a continent and a world be in control of this.
You not hear at the back.
You've got a particularly deaf person at the back who's got places can't hear me preach either, John. So.
That's not correct. I'm not deaf. I can't
He's lost his flow. He's lost his flow now.
for the benefit, for the benefit of the person from back, I was trying to be briefly rehearsing some of the things I've already said, which you can probably recap anyway, but what I was doing was trying to rehearse the problem of corrupt elites and these wonderful people who have such academic brilliance who become bankers, but as a group can be somehow so corrupted, and I've referred to a film which some of us will have seen called Inside Job, which certainly identifies this and sees how this elite continues to perpetuate itself and doesn't get sacked. And what I'm suggesting is that traditionally religion has been some attempt to control elites, and perhaps through other economic philosophies, notably communism, has been a great put upon capitalism. Now, I'm not suggesting communism is the alternative, but what I'm saying is that in a democratic society, surely we can make sure that the people, as a whole, democratically elected leaders, better politicians perhaps, can actually sort of make sure that this sort of thing doesn't happen by an elite which may have many virtues but can't stop itself from corrupting.
Right, is that, can you hear me at the back?
Yeah.
So a couple of different levels there. First thing I would say is that I think what I tried to say, and I hope this has been heard, and I'm conscious that it does actually touch to some extent on the point that the previous, so was it Sean made, was about the point of demonisation as such. And the point that I was trying to make was that I have really tried to step back from talking of a group, being an elite, as a group which is fundamentally flawed on some level. I worked in the marketplace. I did not work with some of the people that may have appeared in this particular film, or others. All I can say is that the vast majority of the people that I worked with were not like that. That they tried to do their job to the best of their ability, to try and help their customers do what they needed to do, okay? Genuinely. And many of them were superbly educated. Yeah? A number of them were in all sorts of other things, and many of them actually, particularly I'm thinking of where there's a rather different culture of charitable giving and social involvement. Many of my American colleagues would have been quite active donors politically as well. Almost entirely, I should say, the hedge community donates to the Democratic Party, interestingly, as it happens, but that's just the way it is. As more of an aside than anything else, and make of that what you will. So I hesitate to start to do anything other than restate what I said before, which is that there were some people who behaved absolutely reprehensibly, but that I do not think that we tar all with the same brush because of that. Your example that you used of putting some kind of check or limit, I think touching perhaps on a more statist, communist model as such, of the way that the market operates. The thing that sprang into my mind as you were saying that was, I don't know if anyone here, I think of the lady over there who works in development, might have read Amartya Sen's book on development. Amartya Sen was a Nobel Prize winner. He trained as a philosopher and as an economist, and is an Indian, although he was the master at Trinity in Cambridge at one point. And clearly has his own very real concerns over the Western way of structuring society. But the comment that he made was that the only system of government which has not produced famine, that's a pretty low barrier, that has not produced famine, is effectively liberal democracy with a market system and a free press. And so I take your point, sir, and I particularly think that, of course, there is a sense of frustration, that sense of something must be done, that Lenin's title of his book, wasn't it? Something must be done because of a disaster that we see that has unfolded. But I think the sorts of things that potentially we could snatch at, I think, have the potential for doing more long-term damage than the alternative that we already have, if we can embrace it more fully. The hope that I have, and it's interesting that you mentioned Adam Smith. Adam Smith is one of the seminal economists, having wrote Wealth of Nations, but who did not stop there, who wrote also a theory of moral sentiments that goes on to say that on its own, the market is not sufficient. It is moral behaviour of each of us as a society, and therefore each of us who are market participants. Now, it is the responsibility that each of us has in the way that that market operates. And maybe part of that is our responsibility to police it. If we see a banker behaving badly, then we should sell the stock in that bank. Okay? We should sell the stock, and we should ring up and tell them why we're selling the stock. That is what the Ethical Investment Advisory Group of the Church of England Commissioners will do, for example. They won't simply back away from it, but they'll actually say, we expect you to change, or we will be pulling out. So it's actually using the judo of the market. It's saying that I can do something, I am not powerless. Yeah? To abdicate responsibility from that is where I think part of the sin is. And I'm not trying to demonise anyone, I'm just saying that in each of us, when we do that, when we walk away, it's too difficult, I'm too small, then we are part of a perpetuation of a system which is unjust. And so it is an encouragement with our faith as Christians to be more active in doing so and seeing beyond not the other. Anyway, so sorry. This gentleman had a question.
Chris, you said Justin was first.
I'm sorry.
So you've got his hand up first, and then Julian last. Okay.
Yeah.
Good, right.
Can you hear me, Roger? Is that all right? Okay, good. Just checking in. I actually have some sympathy with that, with the point of view that we, at some level, are universally culpable. I don't think to the same extent that those who have power and money and no, but I think there is something to be said of that. It's particularly evident, I think, in the issue of perspective, because I come from South Africa and there are people in that country who would look at my lifestyle and consider it to be completely excessive. I have to, I put my hand up to that. They would say, why do you have all of this, and why aren't you spending your money more responsibly? So I think that I'm not trying to, as you would say, to vilify all and make the extreme statement, but I think there's something worth thinking about there.